An error has occurred. That's great. Okay, look, I think we're live again now. So, yeah, I think we're good. It might take a while, like a few minutes for some people to pop back in, and there's a 30-second delay. But I can definitely see, I'm just going to change my position in Gary's mod to make sure that it's not a duplicate from the old stream. But I think we're good. So Nick, just give us a couple of minutes, and then how much more did you have to go?
I had like maybe 2 minutes left.
Oh man, that's so annoying. I'm really sorry about that.
No worries, no worries. I'll just go back like half a page.
Yep, sure.
Yeah.
Yep, and I'll
So
just...
there'll be sort of 4 to 6 minutes, I guess.
And look, I'll edit it all back into the final production, but it's annoying because there were some interesting questions popping up which I don't have access to this. That'll be the old stream that's going to be processed and stuff. So, but anyhow, I have some questions that I'd like to sort of get through some discussion on. So let's just keep going, I think.
Yeah.
Because yes, there's a couple minutes left. Okay, and is everybody else on the server? Are you okay there, Emma and Clancy?
Yeah, we're fine. And we also actually still have the questions from before because we didn't refresh one of our mini computers, so we can return to
great.
those.
Yeah, great.
Cool.
Excellent,
Yep.
cool. Now, I'll just start recording as well locally, just to make sure we keep everything. Okay. Yeah, Nick. So welcome back. Sorry about the disconnection.
No worries.
And let's hear the rest of your presentation.
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to just go back just almost a page or so and just pick off from there. Okay. So there's a moment whilst I was working as a tour guide for the Chernobyl zone. I was speaking with a woman as we walked into the ruins of Pripyat's gymnasium. Turning a corner, she stopped mid-sentence. She paused. She then said that she had been here before. Those were her words, been here before. She then began to explain how she would enter from the door over that way, she would take cover behind these pillars, and then would either progress out of this space, either through the broken glass wall, or hop onto a higher level, all the time checking specific entrances. She knew this space from having played it as a Call of Duty multiplayer map, or part of a map. So this was a recollection that wasn't simply about having seen this space before, as one might have felt they've seen something in a film, but having been here. This is a spatial and importantly embodied recollection of this space from the game. So the Stalker games argue a link to the Stalker film and Roadside Picnic not only nor even necessarily primarily by the narrative and visuals. They share a sense of being in a place, a shared landscape sensibility, a shared embodied way of moving and being in a space. So back to being a tour guide in the zone. We're in the basement of what was once a building used as a synagogue near the town of Chernobyl, south of the power plant. We're in the basement and we're making our way through a pitch dark space. We again find ourselves in a darkened corridor. Here the floor has rotted in many places, the floor covering sagging where floorboards have fallen away. Only the joists provide stable footing. As we carefully place one foot in front of another, cameras come out, flashes being repurposed as a way of filling the space of light as tourists kind of fill the corridor with an odd strobing effect as tourist equipment becomes repurposed as a tool for navigating this ruin. So any kind of visitation, right? Any kind of being in a landscape is an embodied experience, but this becomes especially heightened in the zone. Visitors gain a kind of heightened sense of and attention to their movements within this space. Kind of hesitancy, tentativeness, mixed with an eagerness to explore and to touch. So oscillating between a desire to reach out and touch and a hesitation to kind of move back because of the radiation. So tour guides in the zone's primary role is, unsurprisingly, safety. This means aiding visitors in the navigation of the dangers, whether this be through radiation or the rotting floorboards, most of the time being spent carefully directing visitors through the debris-strewn, collapsing and radioactive ruins. Here Pripyat is a strange place, and it's uncanny in the proper sense of being unhomely. A recognizable urban space made unfamiliar by the blurring of boundaries between forest and city. There's more to the kind of unease than this. Movement is cautious. Although generally safe, the invisible dangers are real. Radiation levels can vary by tenfold or more in this space over the space of less than a meter. And so the constant clicking of the Geiger counter in its varying frequencies becomes a soundtrack to the invisible topographies of this landscape. During my 9 months in the zone, I was alone there only once. I spent an afternoon mapping the Pripyat amusement park, and I was mapping the radioactivity of this area. So Geiger outstretched in hand, as one might see in a kind of, well, as I'm seeing it right now with my tool in Gmod, Geiger counter outstretched in hand, I'm watching the LED readout of microsieverts go up and down, and I'm recording this, listening to a telltale shift in the frequency of the Geiger counter's chatter. My goal here is to map the variety of odd hotspots in this space, made possible by its relative openness compared to much of the city, which had become more forest than town. Later, returning home, I fire up the last of the trilogy of Stalker games, Call of Pripyat, released in 2010, and found myself again slowly trying to make my way around, in this case, an invisible gravitational anomaly. Detector outstretched in hand, closely listening to its output. An odd sense of deja vu, but again, not that I had seen this before, but rather that I had been here before. So in the Stalker games, we have the unique radioactive ruined landscape of the zone turned into a space for gameplay in. But this is a landscape mapped onto a kind of a real landscape, not only through visual representation or through geometric recreation of the architectures and topographies of this space. In drawing from the landscape, GSC Game World also drew from the myth and legend of this place, and in combination with the eerily prescient mythos of the film Stalker and the Roadside Picnic novel, the game draws again on this sense of embodied, tentative, slow movement. Alright, so my conclusion then. The first game in the Stalker series comes out in 2007 and the last in the trilogy in 2010. Since then, numerous games have been explicitly set in the Chernobyl zone. More generally, the unique kind of post-Soviet, post-apocalypse of this Ukrainian-developed game world has influenced many games, attempting to emulate its more slow, melancholy, and tentative approach to post-apocalyptic urban ruins. The Stalker games have also generated a mod scene entirely of their own. Modders got their hands on the source code for X-Ray, this is the name given to the game engine used to build the games, and have released an open source version. At the same time, the developers released their own in-house tools for building the spaces, buildings and other assets in the game. The result has been a proliferation of worlds based upon these games, based upon, in turn, the Chernobyl zone landscape and the Stalker and Roadside Picnic mythos. Multiple mods make it possible to explore the landscapes of all three games stitched together. Many choose to emphasize even more the slow, grueling nature of simply moving through and navigating this landscape. And interesting, all these mods are playable without needing ownership of any of the original games. More broadly then, to conclude, many game spaces are based to a greater or lesser extent on real-world spaces. The Zone and the Stalker are an example of how real-world spaces reappear in games in much more than simply a visual or geometric manner. The shared mythos of the Zone appears not only as, nor even prominently as, visual cues and narrative. Rather, they are found in the tentative movements, the hesitating exploration, halting navigation, that can be found in the book, the film, the game, and in actually exploring the Zone as a visitor. This is best described not as a shared visuality or representational space, nor as a shared geometric space, nor as a shared topography, but as a shared affective and embodied experiential space. Forms of movement, comportment, and navigation are shared between these landscapes. So to conclude, and kind of what I'm kind of moving towards in my own work, simply put, the Stalker games are best thought of, I argue, as landscapes, rather than any other way of thinking about them as either an art form or a space. They are both part of a landscape genre of art, whether that be landscape paintings or landscape films, such as Tarkovsky's film Stalker. But more than this, they are landscapes in and of themselves, affective spaces and phenomenological worlds experienced in an embodied manner. So finally, to the end, this is a small example of a kind of wider argument I'm developing, that games can often be best approached, I think, methodologically and epistemologically as landscapes. So if we're thinking about games as objects of study, I would argue, and this is probably the geography in me coming out most forcefully, that we can treat games as landscapes in the same way that we might treat real-world landscapes, as field sites for study. This in turn opens up a wide range of fruitful avenues for analysis, data collection, methodologies, drawing upon long-standing and more recent approaches to landscape research, whether that be researching landscape art or researching phenomenological landscapes. Taking games to be landscapes means including games into a wider genre of art that has a long history of analysis, but at the same time, the landscapeness of games is not simply representational. So they can be taken as landscapes, as field sites, as spaces for research, opening up a host of ethnographic, phenomenological, affective, and similar methodological approaches to researching landscapes that treats them not simply as representations of existing spaces, but treats them, the games, as objects of study, to be landscapes as landscapes themselves, as spaces of effective and embodied navigation and experience. Thank you.
Wonderful, Nick. Thanks so much. And for all the people who have come back to the stream, or for those that we lost, I'm sorry about the connection issues there. It took me a few minutes to notice that I'd been either kicked off of YouTube or kicked off of the streaming client. But I'm glad we were able to finish Nick's presentation, because there is a little bit of question time stuff that I'd really love to get through as it approaches 2 a.m. in my time zone and before my brain starts to shut down. Nick, one thing I wanted to ask you, and maybe toss it over to Clancy and Emma, is, I don't know if you remember, maybe we discussed this once before, but Half-Life 2 also, I'm pretty sure most of their concept art was based on, I think, British game developers traveling to Eastern Europe in the 90s, I think, something like that. I remember reading in one of the Half-Life 2 fan publications an interview with someone on the art team who was talking about, I think, certain cities in, I'm not sure if it was Poland or Ukraine. And so the City 17 that Half-Life 2 was set in, and where pretty much most of our ruins and rubble in Gary's mod comes from, does have a similar sort of provenance in its origins in some sort of, I guess, Cold War vision from the outside. Even in the color palettes used. And I think it's appropriate to talk about the Stalker games, because we're not that far off. And so what I
I just looked it up. The art director, I think you might be thinking of, is Viktor Antonov.
Yes.
A Bulgarian who worked on the kind of, was the art director for Half-Life 2.
Yes, right. Yeah, I remember there's an I remember reading an interview that where I think they were discussing tourist photos that they had brought into I guess, I don't know, the office or wherever they're working. But what I wanted to ask you was this sort of fragmentation of historical sites, or just sites in general, be they Pripyat or whatever cities the art directors of Half-Life 2 were coming to in some way like a distillation of actual history, but then into this complete fragmentation where we're sort of in the spatial territory of what Clancy and Emma were talking about with the ruins and some sort of space that can't really be rationalized so easily. So the first thing I wanted to ask you, Nick, is like, where are we then? If we know that we're in some sort of, I guess, fractured or broken apart landscape, could you speak to the idea of a space or a place that you think emerges from the leftovers of these very real kind of almost observational representations?
Yeah. So come back to that sort of question earlier about thinking like, what does this kind of word ruin and ruination do? It comes kind of so wide. I'm not sure I see a vast difference between, or at least I don't think there needs to be thought of as a vast difference between the kind of decaying, derelict, and fractured spaces that, I mean, I'm going to use the phrase that exist, as problematic as that is, right? Then the kind of frayed, fractured, derelict spaces that I now see around me in Gmod, right? Like the mode of their fracturedness, the mode of their dereliction is obviously quite different, but they're disruptive in similar ways, I think. Like, they disrupt. So going back to this idea of like sort of postmodernism and the shift between like spatiality and history. Like, at the end of the day, we're talking about just disruptive sensibilities, right? Disrupting how we make sense of and how we pass the space around us, whether that be the space that we're in playing the game or the space we're actually moving through.
Yeah, well, one thing I sort of, what did I want to ask? There was something I wanted to ask, and then my brain switched off a little bit. Oh yes, tourism and tourist photography is, you know, a famously sort of popular way to fragment a landscape. You know, to break it apart into dislocated chunks where, you know, tourist photography is something similar to a form of hunting. You know, you're on the hunt for images that can, on the one hand, give a purpose to your experience, but on the other hand, they're completely disconnected from, you know, the landscape image and the site often have an ambivalence towards one another. And for me, what we have in Gary's mod is a similar sort of fragmentation, that there are little observed fragments that get completely removed. And my question about where we are is, are there traces of where all of these things came from, or do they sort of, I guess, closer to what we talked about last night, does that sort of disappear and it all goes into this sort of washing machine of what we do when we play with them?
Well, I guess you could think of Gmod as a form of kind of montage, right? Like, it's the Pinterest of games. You're kind of taking snapshots, small pieces of, in this case, Half-Life 2, but you can add other games to Gmod's queue menu. And in the same way, you kind of, this kind of proliferation of tourist imagery gets wrung through social media, as we look at it on Flickr or Pinterest or Twitter or whatever, Facebook and so on. There's a similar sort of effect happening in Gmod, I think. It's kind of, if you think of the individual objects as analogous to snapshot photography, right?
So would you think of, say, a Pinterest page of Pripyat as something similar? You know, are we in the same territory, or how would you?
Yeah, I would say that a Pinterest page of Pripyat is analogous to what we have in front of us in terms of a kind of a fragmented set of snapshots of, in this case, Half-Life 2, and in a Pinterest page, Pripyat. I'm not sure I would want to stretch that analogy too far, but I think, and that's the relationship I would go for, is that the kind of the equivalent of the tourist photograph of Pripyat for Gmod is the tree, right, as an object that's been kind of extracted from that space and remediated in a variety of ways.
Although I would sort of jump in here and say that something I found really interesting about your presentation, Nick, because we've talked a bit about this on and off as well, but so Clancy and I both have also been to Chernobyl quite a long time ago and visited, but we never met Nick there that I'm aware of. But what I thought was interesting was that you were speaking to this person and they said, you know, I've been here before. And I think when I did my PhD research, I had sort of started with the assumption that, you know, space in games is a bit like that. It's a postcard or a replica of some sort of, it's a representation, right? Yeah. And so I kind of one of the field work kind of things that I did was I played The Last of Us, and I went to Pittsburgh in The Last of Us, and I sort of roamed around, and it's not a particularly true map either. And then I went to Pittsburgh, and I was really shocked because actually it was that exact experience. I couldn't tell, my brain was not able to distinguish between the experience I'd had in The Last of Us and this kind of real Pittsburgh that I was in. there wasn't a mental distinction. And that's really, I mean, I've never had that experience from a photo. And in fact, photographs are really disappointing. You get to London and you realise that Trafalgar Square doesn't look like you thought it would.
Yeah.
And all of that kind of stuff. And that didn't happen in that case. And it's obviously quite a small example, but I think what's quite interesting, if we want to think about space in a more geographical way, is that moving through a game, doing something active in a game, beyond engaging with objects, actually being positioned in a sense, navigating, being in the map, as Clancy might say, I think it does have some kind of different effect, but it's very difficult to say what that is. And I would also expand on, what you were asking about, Peter, in a sense, and what you also mentioned, Nick, that developers make these sites from their own lived encounters with these sites. So a lot of my PhD was researching that as well. So all the people who did The Last of Us, they didn't just know Pittsburgh because they'd gone to the university there where a lot of game developers go. But actually they had also spent a lot of time doing urban exploration. So the ruins in that game are also very reminiscent of ruinscapes that you might be elsewhere. So I think that's quite interesting, this even though they're obviously very poor copies in a lot of respects, they engage spatially, I think, would be kind of the case that I would make.
Yeah, it's interesting to say like poor copies, because I think like, so the developers I've talked to sort of...
a quote from a games theorist, I can't remember which one.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Because that's developers I've spoken to are kind of working with game spaces based upon real spaces, either directly or indirectly. Like geometric fidelity is kind of useless. Like the most really obvious one that I'm sure people listening will kind of know is that like a corridor in a game has to be squashed, like has to be shorter and wider than it would be in a building in real life. Because if you're playing it on a TV screen and you're sat a few feet away because you're playing it on console, like it has to be squashed, otherwise it's really, really claustrophobic. So like geometric fidelity is never the goal when you're taking a real space and turning it into a game space. And so instead you have developers to talk about trying to capture the feel of being in a space. And that's a very different thing to like a visual or geometric representation. And that's kind of what I'm trying to hint at when I say about treating games as landscapes, is that gets to actually what a lot of developers talk about when they say about how they're trying to create game spaces that are based upon real spaces. They kind of capture the sense of being there is way more than what it looks like or its geometries.
There's just a little anecdote I wanted to bring up there. A couple of years ago when two friends and I were doing a site recreation of a historical site in Hong Kong in the Valve Source Engine, we had this funny problem where we had really accurate GIS data, and we had conversions of the Valve Source Engine works in Valve Source Engine units, or I think it's hammer units or something like that from memory. And we had like approximations of how these units would convert to the measurements we had. And when we built our tunnels, they just looked completely wrong. The sense of space was just way off. And so we figured that either the correlation between hammer units and real world measurements that we got was wrong, or weren't really sure what it was, but it was clear that the space of the avatar, these tunnels just looked 4 times too big. So basically we rescaled the entire map to what looked right. Obviously it has to have a certain dimension so that the avatar won't get stuck anywhere, but it was purely finding the look that when the wide angle lens of the first person shooter camera sort of renders the space around it, we got that to what looked accurate, and then we basically rescaled everything based off one person in one tunnel, and then it had to apply that to the entire landscape, and it worked pretty well. But it was funny that all the relative measurements stayed the same, but whatever we'd done with trying to have an accurate conversion, we just kind of had to throw it out the window.
Yeah.
But I think this is one of the things that kind of comes from what I was sort of talking about with typography, is that like this question of geometric fidelity, or even fidelity between systems, geometry isn't a more stable form of measurement. Like the datum, so Hong Kong's a classic example, with the problem of they call it like the Hong Kong principal datum, or the rifleman's bolt rather, which is the datum that sort of measured sea level for about 100 years in Hong Kong. And the problem is that it was just a bolt that was driven into the edge of one of the wharves in Admiralty. But they had to move it because they did some reclamations and moved the shoreline out. And when they moved it moved onto slippery soil and it began to sink. And so they had like 4 or 5 different measurements for what zero was, based upon this slightly slowly sinking rifleman's bolt that had been changed and was a different height from the original one. And like this ongoing like mythology of stability. And so, you know, when you make maps, it's you can't put everything onto the map anyway. Like cartography doesn't make sense if everything is there. You're constantly distorting bits and pieces to make certain kinds of arguments in much the same way that, you know, you're describing, Peter, with the I presume these are the tunnels up on the Maclehose Trail. Is it the region? Yeah. But yeah, like it's the same kind of problem with mapping in and of itself. And I think this is one of the kind of beautiful fictions, is that it was weird the first time I went to the Bay Area after doing this research on Google Maps, because it felt, again, very much as Em was talking about Pittsburgh being, you know, a kind of home to the games developers who did The Last of Us. That whole area feels like home to Google Maps. Suddenly, the entire structure of Google Maps makes so much more sense in this wide road gridded space, in a way that it doesn't feel normal in Cornwall, it doesn't feel right in outback Australia, it doesn't feel even functional in Hong Kong. So I think there is this kind of mythology as well of the cartographic, which you see exactly the same in games. Like I don't see that there's, you know, I'm not necessarily certain there's huge amounts of difference in these mythologies.
Before we finish up, Emma, you said that you had a few of the questions from
I did,
the previous
and
stream.
then,
are there any that you'd like to particularly engage with?
No, Google Tube sabotaged me. So as soon as I clicked on the page, my Google sign-in popped up and the comments were gone forever.
Oh, okay.
Which is deeply irritating. So they're gone. Yeah, I think the main ones were sort of around this vacillation between, you know, what is a ruin? I mean, I thought the scrap heap challenge wasn't actually a terrible model in a way for what we're sort of talking about, because actually scrap heap challenge does take this fallacy of a scrap heap that's clearly not really a scrap heap, but it does all the things that you want a scrap heap to do. You know, it's full of random stuff. You can assemble things together, you can tear them apart, you know,
conveniently placed objects that just suit that particular task.
Yeah. And I think, you know, the scrap heap model of game design is well and truly alive, and games designers know that. They're fully aware that it's much easier if they put in these kind of really random kind of ruinous spaces, even if they're not literally ruins, that are really chaotic, and people can then just assemble something from the bits and pieces that they can gather. And it also helps to do things like support the fiction of the game as well, that if you've got a ruined landscape where you might just find, you know, bottles or caps or hand grenades, you know, it all makes much more sense than if you're doing it in a much more ordered, seamless kind of space.
Yeah.
So I think sort of make that kind of...
It's interesting, Clancy, to speak to your topic. It's almost like you want to throw a bunch of trash on the ground to cover up what is otherwise quite boring geometry. When the game design work that I'm referencing was actually a custom Counter-Strike map, and the hardest work is filling it with junk to distract from the geometry. And we sort of had to draw the line between being like, you know, artists versus modders, because we're really, as modders go, we're terrible. And so we sort of said, look, you know, like if we were really good in the modding scene, we'd spend weeks just filling this with props. But instead, we the Valve Source engine has this very, very, very efficient geometry system called brushes, where every bit of geometry is coded for sound, vision, and physics all in one sort of item. And you know, when you make a map just out of these things, if you change the texture to like the flat default yellow, it is a kind of, you realize that what games a lot of the time do is, you know, stick an empty Coke can in the corner to because otherwise it just looks utterly bizarre. But so the bizarre bit is your gameplay functionality, and then I guess on a level of atmospheric fiction, it's hiding the corners or something.
But I would also say that this is the whole point of having, architecture or having like consumer culture, or in the world itself, while not a problem of geometry, because it's not, the digital world is very much, polygons and grids and things like that. We insert a grid into the planet. We make a planetary grid system, and then we insert buildings onto the grid, and then the buildings are really big and we have to fill them with something, so we put chairs in there. Like, I actually don't think this is that different. This is all spatial practice.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's what I was sort of saying at the beginning with laws of perspective. I teach. I've had experience teaching perspective drawing, and the funniest part of it is trying to find a good subject, because you have to find a bit of the world that works well for perspective, and it's, whereas if you want to teach observational drawing, you get a plant, but a plant is terrible to teach perspective. So from the house where all the furniture fits in perspectively out to the city block, and ultimately to kind of the electrical grids that span across a continent, there is this tension between, I guess, space that can be gridded and the space that is I guess too hot to handle or something.
It's rubble.
Yeah, the grid and the rubble. Maybe that's what we should have called this. I'm starting to fade a little bit, guys. How do you feel about wrapping it up?
Yeah.
Great. So I've recorded both the main session and our little addendum here, and I want to thanks Fred for coming back onto the stream.
Well, thanks Fred.
Thanks, Fred.
And I guess this will come out when I edit the videos. But thank you everyone who tuned in today and commented and gave us some really interesting questions to talk about. And thanks to the three of you for responding to the invitation so generously.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us. It's been fun.
Thanks. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, I'll sign off, and I'll talk to you all